When I was a kid, my grandfather used to take me down to the river on the edge of his land. It wasn't much of a river, not the kind you'd see in glossy magazines or postcards. But it was ours. It ran crooked and slow, its water the colour of melted bronze in the evening light. My grandfather, being the stubborn and ingenious man he was, had built a small dam there with his own hands and a rented excavator in the 70s. It wasn't tall enough to power a mill or anything dramatic, but it held back just enough water for irrigation to keep the fields alive in a dry summer and to fill the pond where he'd raise catfish for Sunday dinners. He used to tell me, land without water is just dirt, but land with water, that's power. I never forgot those words. By the time I inherited the property, the old man had been gone nearly a decade. I was working a job in the city, living in a cramped apartment, and only ever visited the land once or twice a year. It was too much work to keep up with farming, and I didn't have the time. Still, I paid the property taxes every year, kept the deed locked in a fireproof box, and always figured that one day I'd either move back or sell it to someone who cared about it the way my grandfather had. To me, it was more than land. It was a piece of family history. The place where I learned to fish, where I first kissed a girl by the water's edge, where my grandfather told me stories about building with your own hands and never letting anyone take what was yours. So imagine my shock when I drove out one spring morning to check on things and found an entire neighborhood standing there. I thought I'd taken a wrong turn at first. Instead of the familiar stretch of meadows and woods, there were paved streets lined with mailboxes, tidy cul-de-sacs with ornamental trees, and rows of cookie-cutter houses painted in tasteful beiges and greys. SUVs and minivans sat in the driveways. Kids' bikes lay on trimmed lawns that weren't supposed to exist. I actually slowed the truck, blinked, and whispered, "What the hell?" I drove deeper in, trying to wrap my head around it. Street signs had been installed, shiny and green with names like River Bend Court and Willow Creek Lane. The absurdity of it struck me. There had never been a river bend, and the only willow around here was a ragged old stump near the dam. 35 homes at least, all of them clearly lived in, some with curtains drawn, others with barbecue grills already blackened from weekend cookouts. For a moment, I thought maybe I had indeed taken a wrong road. Maybe this wasn't my land. But when I reached the end of one street and looked past the houses, I saw the dam, my dam, or rather, my grandfather's dam, right where it had always been, holding back the steady gleam of the pond. And in that instant, my stomach dropped. This was my property. These houses, this whole damned subdivision, had been built on my land. I parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac, next to a playground that sat exactly where my grandfather's corn used to grow. My hand shook as I pulled the deed and survey map from the glove box. I had them with me because I'd planned to finally meet with a county officer about selling off a small portion for hunting leases. The paperwork was crystal clear. Lot boundaries, river access, irrigation rights, all of it recorded under my name. I got out of the truck, still half convinced I was hallucinating, and walked toward the nearest house. A woman watering her front yard looked up at me with suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked. I gestured around us, words fumbling out. "Yeah, what is all this? How long has this been here?" She frowned. "You must be new. This is Riverbend Estates. We've been here about 3 years now." Then, with a little sniff, she added, "If you're selling something, we're not interested. You'll need to contact the HOA board. HOA." The letters hit me like a slap. I swallowed the rage bubbling up in my throat. "Who's the president of this HOA?" She pointed toward a house with a polished stone facade near the entrance. "That one. Mark Jones. He's usually home after 5. But they don't like people soliciting around here. Just so you know. Soliciting. My land, my grandfather's dam, my heritage. and I was being treated like a door-to-door salesman, trespassing on their perfect little world. I walked back to my truck, sat behind the wheel, and stared at the rows of roofs stretching where my family's fields had once waved golden in the wind. My fingers clenched so tight around the deed that the paper crinkled. I stayed parked there for nearly an hour, watching children play in the playground that wasn't theirs, watching sprinklers misting water they had no right to, watching neighbors wave to each other like they belonged here. And the whole time, my grandfather's words pounded in my head. Land with water is power. They had taken what wasn't theirs. They had paved it, built over it, staked flags in it, and now strutted around like they owned it. But they didn't. I did. And if they thought I was just going to roll over and let them laugh in my face, they had another thing coming. That night, I didn't sleep. I drove back to the city in silence, replaying every sight, every sound. 35 homes, 35 families, an entire HOA, erected like some parasitic growth on what was rightfully mine. The anger burned in my chest like coals. I thought of my grandfather and how hard he worked for that land. I thought of the dam, still holding strong, still quietly doing its job, even as strangers used it to water their fake green lawns. And slowly an idea began to form. The next evening, I drove back to the property and parked just outside the neat little entrance, where a brick sign proudly read, Riverbend Estates, a homeowners association community. The arrogance of it made me grit my teeth. That sign was planted squarely on my land, and yet it welcomed people as if I were the intruder. At 5:30 sharp, a silver SUV pulled into the driveway of the stone front house the woman had pointed out. Out stepped a man in his late 40s, dressed in khakis and a collared shirt, the type of guy who probably spent more time policing the color of mailboxes than doing anything meaningful. He carried himself with the stiff posture of someone convinced the world should bend to his rules. I walked up the sidewalk toward him, deed folder tucked under my arm. Mr. Jones, he paused, giving me a once-over like I was some door-to-door pest. Can I help you? Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You can start by explaining why you and your little HOA built 35 homes on my property. His brows furrowed, then smoothed into a smirk. I'm not sure what you think you're talking about. This land has been part of Riverbend Estates for years. Maybe you've got the wrong place. I opened the folder, pulled out the survey, and held it out. This says otherwise. The land belongs to me, deeded, taxed, recorded. Every inch you see around you is mine, including the ground your house sits on. He didn't take the papers, just crossed his arms and chuckled. Look, buddy, I don't know what scam you're running, but this community is fully recognized by the county. We've got roads, utilities, a governing board. People live here. Families? You think you can just show up with a piece of paper and claim it all? My temper flared. It's not just a piece of paper. It's a legal deed. I've been paying taxes on this land for 15 years. You don't own it. None of you do. His smile sharpened into something nastier. Well, good luck with that. Maybe call a lawyer. But I'll tell you now, lawyers won't help you. The county approved development. We've been here long enough that nobody's going to side with you. Adverse possession, community rights, blah blah. You'll waste a fortune fighting us. Meanwhile, this is our neighborhood. So I suggest you leave before I call security. Security. On my property, I stared at him, words choking in my throat. He didn't even look nervous. He looked amused, like I was just some nuisance he'd brush off at the next HOA meeting. You'll regret this, I muttered finally, stuffing the papers back in the folder. He gave me a condescending pat on the shoulder before walking up his driveway. Sure I will. Have a nice evening. I drove home seething. That night, I dug through every file I had, every record, every tax receipt. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't mistaken. The land was mine, plain and simple. But Mr. Jones's smugness wasn't empty bravado. It meant he knew something. Maybe they had greased palms at the county office. Maybe they were banking on the fact that most people didn't have the money or patience to fight a long legal battle. I considered lawyering up. I even called one the next morning. He listened politely, asked for the details, then sighed. Cases like this drag on for years. Developers usually win by wearing people down. Even if you're right, it could bankrupt you before you see justice. Even if I have the deed, even if I've paid taxes the whole time, I pressed. Yes, he said flatly. Courts aren't always about being right. They're about who can endure the longest. And HOAs, they've got funds pooled from dozens of homeowners. You'd be fighting 35 pockets at once. Unless you've got millions to burn, I'd advise letting it go. Let it go. The words haunted me, but the thought of my grandfather's dam kept circling in my head. That dam was the heart of this land. And when I drove back the next weekend to walk the property line, I noticed something that made my jaw tighten. The HOA had tapped into the water system. Their sprinklers, their fancy little man-made pond with a fountain in the middle. It was all fed by my dam. They hadn't just stolen the land. They'd hijacked the water too. I crouched near one of the irrigation lines, tracing it with my eyes until it disappeared beneath neatly mulched flower beds. They'd buried the theft, literally. Beneath petunias and decorative gravel, the sight of it nearly made me laugh. My grandfather would have spat on the ground. Parasites, he'd have said. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they acted. They might have houses and contracts and a smug little president, but all of it, every single blade of their perfectly green grass, depended on my dam. That night, lying awake in my apartment, I thought about the balance of power. They believed they had it because they had numbers and money and arrogance. But power isn't about numbers. Power is control. And as long as that dam stood, I had control. The next day, I drove back again and walked the old dam. I ran my fingers over the worn concrete, the moss growing in cracks, the gate valve still rusted but functional. Memories of my grandfather came flooding back, him showing me how to open the gate, just enough to irrigate the fields, telling me about responsibility, about never wasting water. I felt guilty for even thinking about using his creation as a weapon. But then I pictured that HOA sign again, those smug faces, the laughter in Mark Jones's voice. My guilt hardened into resolve. I wasn't going to waste years in court, bleeding money, while smug homeowners sipped cocktails on my land. I wasn't going to walk away either. If they wanted to steal from me, they were going to learn the hard way what it meant to take from someone who still held the true power. The water was mine. The dam was mine. The land was mine. And soon, they were going to know it. The following week, I returned early in the morning, long before the HOA residents stirred from their beds. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban silence broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a garbage truck. I parked near the edge of the property where the old dirt road used to be, now cut off by one of their neat paved cul-de-sacs, and walked down toward the dam. The air was cool and damp with the smell of river mud, the same smell that used to cling to me after long days fishing with my grandfather. As I approached, I noticed how the pond had grown larger than I remembered. The water shimmered under the early sun, reflecting a fountain in the middle of the HOA's decorative pond. They had built a wooden walking trail around it, benches scattered here and there where families could sit and watch the water, all of it fed by my dam. I crouched near the valve, the thick iron wheel coated in rust, but still solid. My hand hovered over it. The power was intoxicating and terrifying at once. If I turned it wide open, the pond would swell. The flow would surge downstream, and all that manicured perfection above would be drowned in mud. It would be quick, decisive, but I wasn't ready yet, not without covering my bases. I stepped back, forced myself to think clearly. I needed more than anger. I needed proof. I needed the county, the sheriff, anyone with a badge and authority to see that the HOA wasn't just arrogant, but outright illegal. So I spent the next few days digging into public records, filing requests, visiting the courthouse. What I found made me sick. The development had been fast-tracked, rubber-stamped by a single planning commissioner who'd retired shortly afterward. There were glaring discrepancies, land plots recorded without proper surveys, permits issued without environmental studies, and most damning of all, the water rights filed under community use, without any transfer from me, the legal holder. It was a mess of fraud and laziness that reeked of under-the-table dealings. Armed with the documents, I scheduled a meeting with the county clerk. She was polite, professional, but I saw her lips press thin when I slid the deed across her desk. "This complicates things," she said, scanning the paperwork. "Complicated?" I leaned forward. "They built an entire neighborhood on stolen land." Her eyes darted up at me. "Do you have proof that you've continuously paid taxes?" I pulled out the stack of receipts I'd collected, 15 years' worth, each with my name stamped on it. She flipped through them slowly, sighing as if the weight of the mistake pressed on her shoulders. "I'll be honest," she said at last. "This should never have been approved, but undoing it will be messy. The homeowners will fight. The HOA will fight. You're right legally, but cases like this..." She trailed off, echoing the lawyer's earlier warning. "You might win eventually, but it'll take years." I clenched my jaw. So meanwhile, they just get to sit there, on my property, like nothing's wrong. She gave a helpless shrug. "The system doesn't always move fast. I'll escalate this to the county attorney, but don't expect miracles." I left the office burning with fury, but also armed with something I hadn't had before: official acknowledgement. The county now had a record that the land was mine, and the HOA had no legitimate claim to the water. When I returned to the dam, later that week, I stared at the rusted valve with a new sense of calm. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. Still, I knew I couldn't simply flood them outright, not without giving them one last chance. So I requested a meeting with the HOA board. To my surprise, they agreed, probably thinking they could intimidate me into silence. The meeting was held in their so-called community center, which was nothing more than a refurbished house with folding chairs arranged in rows. About 20 residents showed up, whispering among themselves as I walked in. Mark Jones sat at the front like a king on his throne, flanked by 2 other board members. "Let's get this over with," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've been harassing residents, claiming ownership of property you abandoned years ago. We're here to clear the air." I dropped the folder of documents on the table with a loud thud. "The air's already clear. This land is mine. Here's the deed. Here are the tax receipts. And here," I pulled out copies of the county's acknowledgement, "is proof from the county that the water rights and property boundaries were never transferred. You built illegally. You've been trespassing for years." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some residents shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, but Mark just smirked. "This is nonsense. Even if what you say is true, what do you expect? That 35 families just pack up and leave?" I leaned forward, voice low but firm. "I expect you to make it right. Either buy the land from me at full market value, plus damages, or prepare for consequences." He barked a laugh. "Consequences? You don't scare us. You think you can threaten us with paperwork? Go ahead, sue. You'll be dead before you see a dime." I stared at him, then slowly smiled. Paperwork isn't the only leverage I have. For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. He didn't know what I meant, but he felt the weight behind my words. The meeting ended in chaos. Residents arguing, some shouting at the board, others glaring at me. I walked out calm, almost serene. They had made their choice. The next morning, before the sun rose, I drove back to the dam. I stood there a long time, watching the still water, listening to the distant hum of sprinklers, firing in the neighborhood above. They were already running, siphoning off what wasn't theirs. My hands tightened on the wheel of the valve. For years they had stolen from me, laughed at me, dismissed me. But now it was my turn. I leaned into the wheel, muscles straining against the rusted metal. Slowly, steadily, it began to turn. A deep groan echoed through the dam as the gate creaked open. Water surged forward, at first a trickle, then a rush, then a roaring current pouring into the channels downstream. The pond swelled, its calm surface breaking into ripples that spread wider and wider. I straightened, breathless, heart pounding with exhilaration and fear. It had begun. The sound of rushing water was like music to me. The current grew stronger with every inch I turned that rusted valve. My grandfather's dam was alive again, flexing its muscle after years of dormancy. It wasn't the kind of surge that would sweep houses away in an instant, but it was more than enough to transform neatly trimmed lawns into marshland, to remind these people that their kingdom was built on borrowed ground. I stayed long enough to watch the first signs of chaos. Sprinkler heads sputtered under the sudden change in pressure, and the artificial pond at the center of Riverbend Estates began to overflow, spilling muddy water across the pristine walking trail. I could almost hear my grandfather laughing in my ear, a gravelly chuckle that always meant he approved of something mischievous. By noon, I'd driven into town for a coffee, but when I came back, the neighborhood was buzzing. Residents stood in clusters, pointing at flooded yards. A couple of SUVs crept slowly down the street, tires hissing through puddles that hadn't been there that morning. I parked at a distance, leaning against my truck with arms crossed, watching their little paradise unravel. One man stormed past me, soaked from the knees down. "Goddamn ho," he muttered. Told them that pond wasn't safe. He didn't even glance at me, didn't recognize me as anything but another gawker. That suited me fine. By evening, the situation had escalated. Water filled the playground, burying the shiny new slide in murky brown. The ornamental trees, freshly planted and not yet rooted deep, began to tilt drunkenly in the soggy ground. Kids splashed barefoot through what used to be sidewalks, their parents screaming at them to get inside before they caught some river-borne disease. Then Mark Jones appeared, his khakis mud-streaked, face flushed with fury. He stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac, shouting orders. "Shut down the irrigation lines. Call maintenance. Someone get the county on the phone." His voice carried desperation, and that desperation tasted sweeter than honey. I didn't bother hiding when he spotted me. He froze, then stomped over, each step squelching in the muck. "You," he snarled, jabbing a finger at my chest. "What the hell did you do?" I didn't flinch. "Just opened up my dam, my water, my rights. Nothing illegal about it. You sabotaged our property." He spat, eyes wild. "Your property?" I said, leaning close. "This is my land. You built without permission, without deed, without rights. The only thing propping up your pretty little neighborhood was my water. And I decided I'm done sharing." His jaw clenched, veins standing out on his neck. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." "Good," I said calmly. "And they'll be hearing from mine, along with the county records I've already filed. Every drop of water here is legally mine, and you're stealing it." He tried to hold his ground, but his eyes darted nervously to the growing flood behind him. Neighbors were glaring now, some at him, some at me, but all with fear etched across their faces. By nightfall, the sheriff arrived. 2 patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing. Residents swarmed them, shouting, pointing fingers, demanding action. One deputy came straight for me, hand resting casually near his holster. "Sir, you the one they're saying tampered with the dam?" I handed him the folder without a word. He flipped through the documents under the beam of his flashlight, whistling low. "You've been paying taxes on this land the whole time." "Yes, sir." "And this HOA, no recorded transfer, no deed, nothing." I nodded. "Built without permission. Been stealing water too." "I can show you where they tapped the lines." The deputy sighed, clearly annoyed to be dragged into a mess this big. He closed the folder, walked over to Mark Jones, and held the papers out. "He's the legal owner. County says the water's his. Until a judge tells me otherwise, he hasn't broken any laws." The eruption of voices was deafening. Homeowners shouted at once, demanding arrests, demanding compensation, demanding anything but the truth they just heard. Mark turned purple, sputtering incoherently, but the sheriff's deputies weren't interested in their outrage. They packed up, left me with a nod, and told the HOA to take it up with the courts. That night, I slept better than I had in years. But the story didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's nightmare deepened. The waterlogged lawns turned yellow and brown, the sod rotting in the muck, fences warped and collapsed as the ground beneath them shifted. The decorative pond they loved so much became a stagnant swamp, buzzing with mosquitoes and reeking of algae. Homeowners were furious, not just at me, but at their own board. They demanded answers at every meeting. Voices raised, tempers hot. Some wanted to sue me, others wanted to sue the HOA, and still others just wanted to sell their homes and escape. But nobody was buying, not with flood damage visible from the street, and county records hanging over the whole place like a noose. Mark Jones tried to keep up appearances, strutting around like he was still in control, but I could see the cracks in his armor. Every time I showed up at the dam, he'd storm over to yell, his voice less confident each time. Once, he threatened to physically remove me, but the sight of the sheriff's patrol car parked nearby kept him in check. I wasn't cruel, not entirely. I didn't open the dam wide enough to cause true disaster. No homes washed away, no lives at risk. I only kept the ground just wet enough, the flow just strong enough, to make their lives miserable. A reminder, a lesson. And slowly the balance shifted. One evening, a homeowner approached me quietly as I stood by the dam. He was middle-aged, tired-looking, his shoes muddy. "Listen," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know any of this. None of us did. We thought the HOA had the rights. We were told everything was legit when we bought. If I'd known, I swear I never would have moved here." I studied him, the honesty in his eyes. "You're not the one I'm after, but you chose to trust people who didn't bother checking the truth. That has consequences." He nodded miserably. "Yeah, it does." The lawsuits began soon after. Homeowners turned against the HOA, accusing them of fraud and negligence. The board tried to deflect, but the paper trail was clear. They had known the land wasn't theirs, or at least they hadn't bothered to confirm it. The county attorney joined in, launching an investigation into how the development was ever approved. The HOA's funds drained fast, eaten up by lawyers and payouts. Maintenance stopped. The community center shut down. Those proud ornamental street signs grew rusted and crooked. And all the while, the water kept flowing, a steady reminder that I held the power they could never take back. Mark Jones avoided me after that. He no longer shouted, no longer threatened. I saw him once from a distance, standing in his yard as water pooled around his expensive landscaping, staring blankly at the ruin of his kingdom. For the first time, he looked small, powerless, exactly as he should. Months passed, and Riverbend Estates looked less like a polished suburban dream and more like an abandoned construction site. The water had done its work slowly, methodically, never catastrophic, but always persistent. Driveways cracked where the ground had softened beneath them. Sidewalks tilted unevenly, and entire yards turned into swamps thick with weeds and mosquitoes. For sale signs dotted the streets, but no one came to buy. Realtors stopped listing homes there, quietly advising clients to look elsewhere. The county investigation had finally gathered momentum. It turned out that shortcuts had been taken at every stage of the development. Permits skipped, land surveys ignored, environmental checks falsified. The retired commissioner, who'd rubber-stamped the project, refused to comment, but the paper trail was clear enough. The neighborhood had never been legitimate. It should never have existed. The HOA tried to hold itself together, but the lawsuits gutted it. Homeowners who had once waved cheerfully to each other at mailboxes now met in courtrooms, shouting accusations. Many of them directed their rage at Mark Jones, the man who'd convinced them all that everything was above board. He was supposed to protect them, to run the HOA with order and control. Instead, he had built their lives on sand. I'd hear things whenever I drove into town. Rumors of divorce filings, of bankruptcies, of families walking away from homes they could no longer afford. Riverbend Estates had become a cautionary tale, whispered about by realtors and chuckled over in coffee shops. And me, I stayed patient. I kept visiting the dam, adjusting the flow just enough to remind anyone who forgot who really held the cards. Every time I leaned on that iron wheel, I thought of my grandfather's words. Land with water is power. I was living proof of that. It was almost anticlimactic when the county attorney finally called me. "Mr. Harris," he said, voice grave but tinged with respect. "I'm pleased to inform you that after months of review, we've determined Riverbend Estates was constructed illegally on your land. The HOA has been ordered to compensate you for damages, and the residents will be required to negotiate purchase agreements directly with you if they wish to remain." I sat there in silence, the weight of it sinking in. "So, they either pay me or they leave." "That's correct," he said. "And considering the lawsuits and flood damage, I don't expect many to stay." He was right. Most packed up and left within weeks, abandoning homes that had once cost them their life savings. Some tried to fight in court, but the evidence was stacked against them, and their funds were already drained. The HOA itself disbanded, bankrupt and disgraced. Mark Jones disappeared. I heard he sold his car and skipped town, unable to face the community he'd led into ruin. One by one, the houses emptied. Windows went dark, driveways cracked further, weeds climbed the siding. Riverbend Estates became a ghost town. 35 shells of homes, standing as monuments to arrogance and greed. I walked the streets once, after the last family had gone. It was quiet, eerily so. The playground was half buried in mud, the swing chains rusting in the damp air. The decorative pond was nothing but a stagnant pit, buzzing with insects. The proud sign at the entrance lay toppled, its bricks scattered like broken teeth. I stood there a long time, breathing it in. The silence, the emptiness, the victory. It didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. More like inevitable. They had taken what wasn't theirs, and the land had swallowed them whole. Eventually I made the decision to sell the land, not to another developer, never again to people who try to carve it up and slap a fancy name on it. I sold it to a conservation trust that promised to restore the fields and keep the river running wild and free. The payout was more than I ever could have imagined. Market value plus damages from the HOA's settlement. Enough to clear my debts, buy a home outright, and set myself up comfortably for years to come. But it wasn't the money that satisfied me. It was the justice. Sometimes late at night, I drive back out there. The trust has already started its work. The sidewalks are torn up. The asphalt roads pulled away. The houses dismantled piece by piece. Grass grows where lawns once drowned. Trees have been planted where cul-de-sacs used to sprawl. The dam still stands, but now its flow is managed carefully, ensuring the river runs steady through the restored land. I'll sit by the water's edge, watching the current move with quiet strength, and I'll hear my grandfather's voice again. Land without water is just dirt. Land with water is power. The HOA thought they had power. Rules, fines, smug grins, and arrogance. But in the end, all they had was borrowed ground and a false sense of security. I had the deed. I had the water. And when the time came, I reminded them who the land truly belonged to. When I rise and leave, I look back one last time at the river flowing past, carving its patient path through the earth. It carries away the last traces of Riverbend estates, erasing them as if they had never been. And I smile, because in the end, the land is free again. No HOA, no fraud, just water, earth, and memory. In the end, the story of Riverbend Estates became less about 35 houses and more about what happens when arrogance meets truth. The HOA believed paperwork and numbers gave them power. They thought ignoring a deed and sneering at its owner was enough to erase history. But they forgot the one thing my grandfather always said: land with water is power. By controlling the dam, I controlled their future. I didn't need endless lawsuits or years of wasted money. I just had to let the river remind them who truly owned the ground beneath their feet. Their homes, their lawns, their rules. All of it washed away. Not in one violent surge, but in slow, relentless truth. The county finally admitted the mistake. The HOA collapsed under its own greed. Families fled. Mark Jones vanished. And the neighborhood became a ghost town. What was once a monument to entitlement turned into a lesson carved into mud and broken fences. And me? I didn't just reclaim my inheritance. I restored it. I turned the land over to people who would protect it, who would honor the river instead of exploiting it. My grandfather's dam still stands, not as a weapon, but as a symbol, a reminder that power comes not from arrogance, but from stewardship. The HOA tried to steal what was mine. They ended up with nothing, and I walked away with justice, peace, and the certainty that no one would ever pave over my family's legacy again.